So welcome everyone to the Mental Health Commission of Canada's webinar series on recovery-oriented practice. This is the fourth webinar in our 7-part series that the Commission will be holding in English. And we also have a series of French language webinars that's planned for later this fall. Our topic today is Recovery is Personal. And we're thrilled to have participants joining us today from across Canada, as well as several international colleagues joining us from Australia, Germany, Saudi Arabia, the UK, and the US as well. We'd also like to give a special welcome to those of you that are joining us today as a team. So my name is Carla Thorpe. I'm the Director of Prevention and Promotion Initiatives with the Mental Health Commission, and I'll be the host for today's webinar. On the screen, you'll see that we do have some social media hashtags for you to use if you do want to tweet about today's webinar. Our hashtag that we use for our recovery initiative is hashtag MHCC Hope Lives, and you can also use our Twitter handle, which is @MHCC_. I did want to remind you that once our webinar is complete today, there will be a post-webinar survey, so we'd ask that you please take a moment to provide us with some feedback on today's webinar, also on topics that you might be interested in for future sessions. And there's also an option for you to indicate whether or not you'd like to receive invitations from us for future webinars. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in joining us for future events and webinars, to opt in to receive future communications from us. So just before we get started, we'll just go through a few short housekeeping items. If you do want to send any questions or comments to us, as I mentioned, we have muted everyone today. We have a very large group that's joining us. So we'd ask that you communicate with us online, either using the Q&A feature or the chat feature. If the window doesn't show up for you automatically, on the right-hand side at the top of your screen, you can see a little conversation bubble that says chat underneath it, or a question mark bubble that says Q&A. You can just click on those, and then the window should open up that will let you type in your questions. We'd ask that you send them to all panelists so that our presenters, as well as myself as the moderator, will receive the questions, and then we can ask them on your behalf during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar today. We are also recording the webinar today so that we can post it on our website in the webinar archive section, where we've posted our previous webinars as well, and that should be ready in about 2 weeks' time, so that if you have colleagues or others that might be interested in viewing the webinar afterwards, they can do so online. So this webinar series is meant to be an introduction to the guidelines for recovery-oriented practice that was released by the Mental Health Commission in June 2015. The guidelines were developed through a long process involving extensive consultation and really attempt to take the concept of recovery and provide a comprehensive review of what it means to actually apply a recovery orientation in practice by an individual or also by an organization. The guidelines themselves and our webinar series are really following each of the individual chapters or sections within the guidelines. So we started our webinar series in January with an overview by Dr. Howard Chodos, who provided an overview of the guidelines as the key author of the document. And then we've been going through and looking at each of the dimensions in a little bit more detail. So we covered off dimension number 1, creating a culture and language of hope, and also dimension number 6 in our webinar last month on transforming services and systems. So those first 3 webinars are available to you, again, through our website free of charge in the webinar archive section. So today our focus is going to be on dimension number 2, which is recovery is personal. And we're thrilled to have 2 speakers with us today who are going to walk through the material. Our first presenter today is Brian McKinnon. He's a community development coordinator with an organization called Alternatives, which is a counseling service in Toronto. He's a family member and a longtime ally of the psychiatric survivor movement. In that role, he works with survivors, families, and professionals to initiate and coordinate educational events that explain and promote the concept of recovery, as well as explore alternatives to the medical model. Key partners for Brian in this work include the Leadership Project and INTAR, the International Network Towards Alternatives and Recovery. So Brian will be our first presenter today, but I'll also introduce Fiona Wilson, who will be our second presenter. As a person with lived experience, Fiona has been a strong advocate and educator within the mental health system for more than 2 decades now. In addition to consultation and training work on recovery-oriented practice, care, peer support, trauma-informed care, and stigma, Fiona is the professional practice lead for peer support and the manager of patient and family collaborative support services at St. Joseph's Healthcare, Hamilton. Fiona is also a member of the board of an organization called PSR Canada, past chair of the Certification Committee for Peer Support Accreditation and Certification Canada, and an assistant professor with the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurosciences at McMaster University. So just before I turn things over to Brian, what we wanted to do is something a little interactive for you and try to give us a bit of a snapshot of the profile of those that are joining us for the webinar today. So on the whiteboard in front of you, you'll see 4 columns, either for practitioners, individuals with lived experience, family members and caregivers, or other participants. So on the left side of your screen, right at the very top, you'll see an arrow. And if you click on that arrow, your name will appear, and it'll allow you to drag the arrow into one of those categories that you feel best represents who you're joining us as today. Now, I will caution you that if you don't want your name to appear in the category, then you certainly don't need to participate in this exercise. But when you click on the arrow, the name that you registered under will appear, and that will show up under the category. So for those of you who do wish to participate, we'll just give you a moment, again, to click on the arrow on the left-hand side and then drag it into the column that best represents the category you're identifying with today. Great. So it looks like we've got a lot of practitioners with us. It looks like that's sort of the predominant category in terms of our audience, but quite a great distribution of people with lived experience, family members, and other individuals as well. So thank you for participating in that. And Brian, I'm now going to turn things over to you. We're just going to, again, unmute your phone line here, and I'll turn it over to you to get us started with the first part of the presentation.
Awesome, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we've got you loud and clear, Brian. You're now live.
Okay, thanks. Well, welcome everyone. It's nice to see so many names of some of whom I know, and I hope you. A lot of what I'm going to share with you, you already know, but I'll try and make it interesting above and beyond the generalities. Okay, so let's proceed to the next slide. Is the agenda. Recovery is personal is the theme of the day, and the topic is broad and general and wide open for I suppose interpretation and subjective commentary. So that's a lot of where that's my base. I work from from that position. I don't consider myself a full-blown professional. I'm more of a humanist in my orientation, and so that will partially explain where I take this. So you know, the topic is very individualized, as in personal. But you know, you can't address this subject without the concern that recovery is not just personal, it's also political. So I'm going to go from an individual level, I suppose, to a more general and societal level in my comments. And I suppose I come at this subject from a left of center perspective, and it's going to offend some, but don't get overly worked up about what I'm sharing with you. Just take it as one person's experience. Mind you, my point of view and my values and my work is shared by many in the community. And so do keep that in mind, that my points of view are reflective of a broader community, and I'd like to say most definitely and that of the survivor community. So again, don't take offense in terms of what I say. Just chalk it up to one person's perspective, and take what's unique and true to you from my presentation, and just try and pay it forward. And in other words, try and bring something, you know, in terms of your responses to whatever I say today. Try and offer something positive. That is the basis of hope and meaning within the recovery community. My agenda, you know, proceeds from the recovery as personal and quickly addresses the differences between clinical and personal recovery. We move to a rather focused summary of the Mental Health Commission's personal recovery vision. We address the historic and political roots of recovery. We look at how personal recovery is tied to healing relationships and a caring community. We address the barriers to personal recovery and the barriers to recovery as policy and practice. And we look at what's necessary for recovery implementation. In other words, social change and strong leadership. Now, I'm not going to read the whole next slide. But it's an important contribution. Not sure I knew a minute. There it is. It's from a document from 2009, the consumer-focused recovery document, largely prepared by Nessa Martin, a valued colleague of mine. And why don't you just take a minute, like 20 seconds, and read this over so you can see where we're coming from, because this document, this quote was written in 2009, and it's as relevant as today as when it was prepared 7 years ago. Thank you, Nessa Martin, for your excellent writing. Notice how she's talking about what it's not in order to get to what it is and what it should be: social inclusion, self-determination, hope and meaning, empowerment, and how it's a personal experience. Okay, the next quote, the next slide is a way of distinguishing, clarifying more of what personal recovery is. If we address the bigger picture, the professional goal, that is clinical recovery, so the first statement is that for many people, including professionals, recovery means when the symptoms of an illness have gone. This is what professionals call a clinical recovery. And this emerges from professional literature. Focus on sustained remission and restoration of functioning is invariant across individuals and has been used to establish rates of recovery. Now, but clinical recovery is absolutely essential and desirable and liberating. But while that's not often achieved, or not achieved as often as one would like, we need to still find a place where we can have quality of life, even while living with some of the aspects of the initial experience or illness, depending on your point of view. So as you can see, there's a critical comment about where we're coming from. That, you know, Ron Coleman, a survivor activist and a voice hearer, says that if you look through the literature search, he says that the profession was never that concerned about recovery. Instead, you know, the word was always about outcome, which is a neutral term rather than a positive aspirational concept like recovery. And that over time it came to be adopted by the professional, recovery came to be adopted by the professional sector as they realized that we should be more hopeful and more optimistic, which in itself, as I say, is a good thing. So, again, clinical and personal recovery are obviously interrelated, but they're different. And a psychiatrist, colleague, friend of mine in Vienna, Michaela Amarine, says that, and companies say that personal recovery has emerged from consumer narratives, focus on living a satisfying, hopeful, and contributing life even within limitations caused by the illness. So, and you've heard this addressed by others such as Anthony. One of the first quotes used in terms of defining recovery was with the PSR guru William Anthony, who says, personal recovery is a deeply personal, unique process of changing one's attitudes, values, feelings, goals, skills, and roles, the way of living a satisfying, hopeful, and contributing life, even within the limitations caused by illness. Recovery involves the development of new meaning and purpose in one's life as one grows beyond the catastrophic effects of mental illness. And then Eleanor Longden and Slade say below, the role of mental health services is to skillfully support the person to move through their recovery journey. So, kudos to the Mental Health Commission of Canada for making a focused and for championing recovery, shall we say. I mean, the whole world is moving in this direction, and Canada has been slow, but the Mental Health Commission of Canada, while its influence and outreach is limited because of other provincial sovereignty over their own health affairs, so, you know, they can't do much more than speak from a bully pulpit, but their prose is moving. It shows that they do get the recovery vision, that they are well positioned to represent the community. Some people may not think that they go far enough, but notwithstanding, they work in a balanced fashion to address the consumer-focused agenda of recovery. So in other words, they, as much as possible, they give credit where it's due in terms of whose job it is to recover, who can do the most to lead the recovery, who has contributed to recovery as we know it. It is the consumer community, and the Mental Health Commission gets that and reflects that in his writing. As you can see by way of the second bullet, they avoid putting labels on people, and they understand that mental illness is not one thing, not strictly biological, that it's an interplay between multiple factors, including biological, psychological, social, economic, cultural, and spiritual. Similarly, they go on to show that we have it within ourselves to rise above challenges, adversity, that we have resilience, and that in order to tap that resilience as much as possible, we should be self-determining in terms of our preferences and what we reject, and a message to everyone involved in recovery that practitioners, professionals, that we need to we need to do our homework in respect of the recovery paradigm, and that it involves critical reflection, listening, and being prepared for continuous learning. And then the Mental Health Commission talks about, what I address here in an ideal world. If recovery-oriented practice would allow for all of these interventions and options. And so it covers the gamut, but in reality, our system is just not that flexible and well equipped. So I guess, as I say below, I think we may be stretching the idealism a little far. And perhaps the main point is that we've got to do it different, and the best way to do that is to keep it personal, real, and true. So most of what makes a difference in the recovery philosophy is that it demystifies the medical character of the problem and makes it about who is there for you and who are you going to call. And so it explains something of what recovery is. On some level, it relates to what Nessa Martin was doing earlier in explaining what it is not. So the simple slogan, recovery is personal, is rather misleading in its simplicity. And we should avoid skepticism because this, this movement is challenging in all of its positive ramifications. And it's not one thing, it's a process, a methodology, a philosophy, a lived experience, and so on. The recovery approach does not condense complex personal issues and behavior into a single diagnostic entity that is based in metaphor, i.e. a chemical imbalance, and therein lacking scientific credibility. Recovery is not reductionist. It is concerned with a broad canvas of psychological distress and human aspiration as a person strives to find meaning and restore an identity apart from a diagnosis. And we need to go beneath the surface of diagnosis to inquire how a person may have been hurt, threatened, traumatized. Again, we go away from the question, what is wrong with you, to what happened to you, excuse me. And the personal dimensions of recovery lead us to acknowledge that recovery is difficult, that there are times when it is more of a perilous struggle than a personal journey. And above all, recovery is complex because it is about us, what makes us, drives us, messes with us, fixes us. And that is much deeper than science can go. So the background, as I was saying, the background to recovery, where does it come from? And when we say recovery is personal, we can see that in terms of the history of the psychiatric survivor movement. The movement has always been about, the recovery movement has, the survivor movement has always been about peer support. People felt injured and united in anger against the psychiatric system in the 70s, and their reflexive response among each other was as much about support as it was protest. So peer support ultimately became the prominent expression of the movement, which set the stage for the rise of the recovery movement, which in turn is premised on support and interconnectivity. So recovery is about positivity. But we would not be having this enlightened discussion about recovery, but for the righteous anger of people who had previously been forcibly tied down, injected, and shocked against their will. Never forget that recovery is tied to people saying no. The personal dimensions of recovery may sometimes involve us in advocacy and other times in street-level protest. This should not be dismissed as radicalism. Rather, it is a valid and vocal response to historic and systemic injustice. And recovery flourishes in environments of hope, expressiveness, and solidarity. These environments are frequently found at street-level protests where people agitate for human rights. Indeed, recovery flourishes when people find their voice and are encouraged to be strong and direct as they speak truth to power or to loved ones. So, based on what I'm saying about recovery coming out of the peer movement and coming out of peer support, it's by the same token that we can conclude and move constructively necessarily to increase our ability to provide peer support throughout the system. After all, it is a best practice, widely recognized. So, are we invested in building autonomous peer support programs and peer-run recovery centers like Soundtimes and the Psychiatric Survivors of Ottawa? Or, because there's not enough movement in respect of peer support, there's not, I mean, yes, we're talking about it, but there's not enough happening in the way of funding decisions. And so my question and challenge is are we stepping back from this intrinsic commitment to recovery implementation? And by the same token, just because we're funding peer support within the system does not mean that you know, covers the gamut of need. We need autonomy. Self-determination needs to be registered, expressed, and funded at the community level, and not just within the mainstream system, not just with ACT teams and so on. Okay, so the next slide relates to some perspectives taken from the British Psychological Society's booklet. It's well worth picking up, Understanding Psychosis and Schizophrenia. And they have two beautiful quotes here that address the primacy of emphasis that they place on human connection, on caring, kindness, and empathy. And what it comes down to is that you just can't do better when you are in distress than the human touch, and than with emotional support. And as it says, even the briefest of human communication has a disproportionately powerful and positive effect if it is based on an empathetic approach. And there is no us and them. This is what I believe, because I believe all of our challenges, so-called mental illnesses, are societal and historical in character. And everything that gets inscribed in our DNA and our genetics and our personalities are all tied to our societal experiences and our historic connections to our, you know, our ancestors and the politics of the political environments in which they lived and so on. So it's a big picture point of view, and I really think that's the basis for understanding why there is no us and them when we are talking about mental health. Another related point to prior relates to the notion of empowerment and connectedness, and some colleagues in Ireland and in England, Pat Bracken and Phil Thomas, both critical psychiatrists, say that there is a growing appreciation that personally meaningful recovery from serious mental disorder is not necessarily related to specific treatments that are prescribed. Research has pointed to the importance of the therapeutic alliance in determining outcomes. Others point to the importance of self-esteem and an internal locus of control. It seems that creating a therapeutic context that promotes empowerment and connectedness and that helps rebuild a positive self-identity is of great significance. And based on the above, you know, one can conclude that the relationship is the bridge to recovery and community. So this is not rocket science or medical science. Simply, people feel better when they are supported with positive regard, solidarity, and compassion. And whether people experience community in their peer network, an activity center, a case management agency, their family, their workplace, or a local cafe, it does not matter, as long as they feel included, respected, and empowered. And this is facetious, but it's core in terms of people's capacity for recovery, that they start examining the process, the workings of their own mind. If the mind is geared to the messages of negativity, if the mind is prone to beat up on self, then it's really important that a person be supported to understand that this kind of experience within the mind has been socially constructed, and that one needs to look within in order to find something well, deeper and dig deeper for compassion for self, if you will. I mean, with the fact that people are so conditioned to be hard on themselves, then there's no confusion or ambiguity about why people would be enslaved to negativity, enslaved to self-doubt, enslaved to worry, to stress and shame and rumination. So I mean, these are all kind of automatic, based on how identity is socially constructed. So we need to go deeper and find that higher mind, as we've learned in meditation practices, that there is a me behind the mind, safe beyond the trappings of identity, personality, behavior, and diagnosis. And this is where we tap our inner strength and resilience. I could go on, I'd love to, but that's enough because the clock is ticking. Another important point in respect of how people recover, many recovery narratives are tied to spirituality. Yet this is something that, rigidly rational and mechanistic worldviews can dismiss as overly imaginative. So we need to stay open and create space for dialogue about altered states of being and altered perception. And so if we know that if we know the importance of the relationship within recovery, then why are we so frequently told don't get too personal? Because in my mind, recovery is personal. So don't be like, why should we then be warned against creating dependency or becoming codependent within a helping relationship? Recovery is personal, yet the system is not. The social and psychological professions belabor the notion of boundaries to the extent that they inadvertently produce stigma. And in so doing, they make consumers feel like they are second class in their symptomatic, all-consuming need to act out dependency patterns at the expense of beleaguered professionals. And I hope you can detect my sarcasm in respect of these kind of points. It's just we need to, well, it speaks for itself. So one more point, professional obsession with boundaries places a barrier between recovery theory and practice. It makes for a measured approach which can place severe constraints on how people express and experience support, which runs counter to one of the cardinal principles of recovery, which seeks transformed relations and increased empathy between workers and survivors. Another point that amounts to a barrier to the implementation of recovery is the fact that we are still working in cold, impersonal manners, in a cold and impersonal manner in some areas of mental health. And many survivors will attest to this, that they are in psychiatric wards and they feel like they're being neglected and ignored, and this is essentially, while there's much good work going on in the hospital wards and undoubtedly warmth and compassion being shared and expressed, much of what goes on is counter to the humanitarian spirit of what the ministry, the Mental Health Commission recommends. And so I ask, will we ever see a change on this level where all people on a psych ward feel supported rather than stigmatized and numbed out by their treatment experience? The fact that people still have that sense of inadequacy within a treatment environment is just wrong. We can do better. So this leads to why things will go that way. It's because we are working within a rather technological and mechanistic framework. In other words, something known as the biomedical treatment model. So the personal dimensions of recovery demand that we examine the limits of the medical model and deal squarely and honestly with the effects and problems with psych drugs. And a recovery-oriented mental health system will provide full and balanced information about the general health risks attached to psychopharmacy. Of course, psych drugs are useful and frequently essential for recovery, but we should not create false security about the drugs being medications that address an underlying pathology. Science does not, or it does not yet support that assumption. And I just want to draw your attention to one quote from Bonnie Burstow, Psychiatry and the Business of Madness, wherein she deconstructs the tension between the drugs that are used and the conditions that are being addressed. And she says, with clarion clarity, no medical credibility can be attached to a substance that is not medical, that addresses nothing medical, that gives rise to medical disorders, and whose modus operandi is dysfunction and damage. I mean, that's extreme, but it's also accurate. So that's just a wake-up in respect of what we're dealing with. We don't know what we're dealing with. It's part of a human complex. Psychiatry is well equipped to do its part, but it needs to do so with more, what would you say, honesty and compassion, such that people know that their medications are well, risky. And that ties us into a message that was widely shared by some mental health providers in Toronto with a booklet that they put out, 40 years is too young to die, which ties us to the concern that our treatment environment, much of the treatment in there is iatrogenic, which in other words causes medical conditions. So the treatment is causing medical problems, but we are not encouraged to explore the moral long-term ramifications of this dilemma. This is an example of where recovery advocates can be seen as being too political and disruptive when they are merely doing their job as critics, allies, and witnesses. So we cannot consider ourselves to be recovery-oriented if we continue to sweep this reality and these questions under the carpet of expediency and best intentions. The next quote is, again, in reference to a book title by a critical psychiatrist, David Healy, wherein he calls it Pharmageddon. And that brings us to some of these major points that, again, amount to barriers to recovery. Practitioners need to be forthright about the not insignificant suicide risks attached to youth use of SSRIs. Overprescribing physicians need to deal with the science that shows that every drug has a therapeutic range beyond which the drug is harmful. The neuroleptic antipsychotic drugs are causing an epidemic of neurological syndromes, and yet these drugs are reaching record sales and prescriptions. And what about in Canada, where we have the highest per capita consumers of antidepressants and anti-anxiety agents? What is it about our psyche, national psyche, that we seriously overvalue chemical remedies that may be harmful, addictive, and frequently ineffective? And the last measure of social recovery is sexual expression, which is frequently undermined by treatment. A consumer may be feeling relatively restored, but it is unable to experience sexual fulfillment because of the impact of the neuroleptics or the SSRIs. So in respect of these problems, we need a systemic harm reduction response, one that stresses less is more or the least intrusive. So we need to help psychiatry to recover. We need to much of the good work that's been done in mental health over these 20 years started with the notion of partnership. Well, psychiatry en masse needs to be working more in the spirit of partnership. Yes, they can play a critical role, and yes, they do play a critical role in people's personal recovery. And yes, the medical model can work within a holistic recovery model. But the main issue is that as a society, we are too reliant on psychopharmacy and not adequately informed about alternatives for recovery. Ron Coleman is quoted again. He says, "It is my belief that a failure to advance this approach, the recovery approach, will not only impede recovery for clients, it will impede the recovery of psychiatry as a health-oriented service and keep it as an illness-dominated institution. Moving away from a maintenance approach towards a recovery approach is therefore essential if organizations are to provide services that are compatible with recovery." Status quo or sunny ways, to reference our new experience of sunny weather in Canada. Well, again, Coleman says, we've got a new energizing vision with recovery. And he says the momentum is building, but so far the philosophy and values of recovery are only practiced in small pockets of the country. And here in Canada, efforts to advance the recovery approach have been successful at the level of hearts and mind and on the so-called front lines or around the kitchen table and so on. But so while the community is leading in its interests, much of the system is unmoved by the innovation and excitement that is being generated locally and globally. So the system is identifiably pro-recovery, but more at a surface level, and progress seems stalled. Mental health reform now seems taken up with efficiencies, accountability, and number crunching. And the media shows little interest in recovery. So in respect of, well, like, what does it realistically take if we were going to see recovery implemented? So let's take the long view and the big picture and look at societal change. In so doing, I think we will be undercutting and responding to situations that give rise to mental illness. So our recovery orientation is founded on the principles hope, empowerment, choice, and responsibility. So why are we living so much at odds with these principles which we hold dear? We need a new societal vision for mental health, one that does not involve labeling, exclusion, poverty, and paternalism. We need to take care of our kids in terms of their inexhaustible need for love. And this will go a long way to addressing the long-term ramifications of where mental illness is concerned. We need more concern for community and less to do with consumerism. Oh my, we need to get away from corporate standards of normalcy and productivity. We are all different, and not everyone should be locked into 9 to 5 ways of being. We need a society that understands we are what we think, and so we need to think more positively, and that we need to think about ourselves with loving kindness, that we should strive for collective happiness. We have leadership and the evidence for recovery, so we need a society that is prepared to follow the leadership and innovate. And we need a society that's more adequately informed about psychopharmacy and alternatives for recovery. Now let's look at quickly these. Let's just run down the list, and you'll see what's innovative and transformative. You'll see all of the things that we could be doing more of. Yes, we're touching on some of these things, but we're just scratching the surface in so many ways, and true recovery implementation would involve avid intellectual investment and funding of some of the below. And in respect of all of these topics, here I want to give a shout out to my friends in the Leadership Project and more broadly to the INTAR, the International Network Toward Alternatives for Recovery. And finally, in terms of the, how do we go from the recovery guidelines to leadership? I suppose the main takeaway is that the more recovery-oriented this mental health system becomes, the more caring and responsive and effective it will be. The Mental Health Commission of Canada has made an important national contribution in its empathetic and insightful articulation of recovery values and guidelines. But whether there's a genuine interest or the social intelligence within the mental health ministry to invest in this model remains to be seen. Perhaps all we can expect in the current professional context is that recovery will remain a hearts and minds phenomenon that is sustained by continuous learning and shoestring innovation. Of course, even for that to happen, we need to keep the discussion going, and it is my hope and expectation that the Mental Health Commission of Canada will continue in its valued leadership role. The only caveat or expectation or hope is that they will be even stronger as leaders than the able job that they've already done. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry if I've gone over my time slightly. It's been a great pleasure doing this work and sharing it with you, and I hope there's been some enthusiasm. Hope I've connected with you on some level in terms of these various points. Thanks again for your interest.
That's wonderful. Thanks very much, Brian. And we hope that you'll stay on the line as well, because we do have a number of questions. So thank you to everyone who sent in some questions already for Brian through the Q&A or the chat feature. So Brian, we'll maybe ask you to stay on the line. We're going to move over next to Fiona's presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions and dialogue at the end for both of you. So with that, Fiona, we're just going to unmute your line, and we'll turn it over to you for the next part of the presentation.
Great, Carla. Thank you so much. And thank you, Brian, for really giving a strong foundation for something for me to springboard off of. As Brian said at the beginning of his presentation, really what I hope to share with you as well is one perspective, and it's a perspective from both my own lived experience but also my observations as someone who has worked in the mental health system in the psych survivor movement and still in a peer-run organization now in a hospital setting. So Carla did a wonderful job of introducing both Brian and I at the beginning, and I'll tell you a bit more about myself throughout the presentation. I do just want to give you a heads up that I am sitting in an office that is in an inpatient hospital setting, so while I'm speaking, there is the off chance that you might hear overhead codes being called, so please ignore them, but my apologies up front for any distraction if that in fact happens. So for the next part of the webinar, I'm going to share what I'm calling a relational perspective on recovery as personal. So simply put, how the relationships we have with others can support and sometimes impede the personal recovery process for individuals. So these may include the clinical relationships, the therapeutic relationships, but also include that broader social network of family, friends, co-workers, community connections through church or any other sort of constituencies that individuals belong to. So specifically what I hope to cover in the next 20 minutes to half an hour are really to talk about the value of human relationships and their positive impact on recovery. But also it's really important, and Brian has certainly laid the foundation again, to talk about some of those things that get in the way, and I'll focus of those things that get in the way at the individual relationship level. We'll talk about the core principles that are in the guidelines through a relational lens, and then we have a bit of an interactive treat for you at the end to allow us together to reflect on our practice to really bring the relationship to life around recovery as personal. So as you already know in my bio, and I've shared that I'm someone who has lived experience starting when I was a teen, but it's also important for you to know that I'm a family member, and again, I'm someone who's worked in the mental health system for over 23 years in both the community and hospital environments, primarily in consumer survivor initiatives in the community, and now, as I said, in a peer-run program in the hospital. In my own life, when dealing with illness, my biggest fear has always been and continues to be to have an experience of loss of control, so loss of control of my own self, but more so loss of control of the power I have over my own choices. So for this reason, you know, it's really important that those around me, my direct family, friends, understand what I want and what I need, and that they trust that my choices are the right choices for me, even if they disagree with me. So equally important is those providers that I choose, and when I can choose them, and I've been privileged that I've been able to do that. So when those providers that I choose to have in my life also understand and support my choices. So for me, mutual respect is actually the cornerstone to any therapeutic relationship. It's actually, for me, the cornerstone to any relationship that I have. And while I need to understand and be informed about choices I have when it's a clinical relationship, the final decision about me is made by me. And when the therapeutic relations stop working for me, I've had the luxury of being able to move on and find other relationships that will work. I have experienced great privilege in that way, where many of my peers have not. So I'll give you an example from my own life of something that happened a few years ago. So I belong to a large family practice in the city as a patient, and I had made an appointment to see a doctor about I had been experiencing kind of big mood swings in the course of a very short period of time, in about a 2-week period of time, and that was quite unusual for me, not something that I had experienced before in my life. In discussing all of the possibilities, and considering my history, and I have a history of anxiety and have had an enormous impact early in my life because of that anxiety, the doctor recommended taking an antidepressant. And I was really reluctant to do that. I generally don't respond well at all to medications because if there's a side effect to something, I'm pretty much guaranteed to have it. And quite frankly, I wasn't convinced that I actually needed an antidepressant, and as I didn't have a history of depression, and nor in my opinion, and I'm not a clinician, but in my opinion, I didn't meet the criteria for depression. However, feeling kind of a bit desperate to stop the feeling, the way I was, I thought about weighing the pros and cons. I did that with the doctor of various medication options, and so we landed on one that I felt comfortable trying. This visit to me felt like the relationship worked. I had the opportunities to voice my concerns. I was given information to make choices. I wasn't pressured one way or the other to do something I didn't want to do. And I felt, for the most part, respected, although I must admit, in retrospect, I wish I had pushed back more on how quickly we jumped to assuming it was depression as an extension of my anxiety. And I'm a very strong advocate for others in the work that I do, but interesting, it was a hard lesson for me to learn around the struggles I had to advocate for myself. So my experience changed about 5 days later when I had to go back to the doctor's office to let him know that I needed to stop taking the medication immediately. Because within about 3 days of being on that medication, I started to experience extreme panic attacks, distorted and suicidal thinking, none of which I had ever experienced before in my life. It was hugely traumatic for me and actually very traumatic for my husband and son who were around me and supporting me at the time. I was convinced it was the medication and nothing else. When I went to the doctor and shared all of this with him, he suggested he needed to up the dosage of what I was taking, and that what I was experiencing was not in fact the medication, but may indicate I needed to be hospitalized. This came as a huge shock to me, and I sort of felt the control that I was used to having slipping away, of being taken away from me. He also suggested that as I was arguing with him, he suggested that if I didn't comply, that I was at risk of being admitted to hospital involuntarily. And I finally experienced, for the first time in my life, something that my peers had described to me many times over and over again of when they had tried to practice autonomy and self-determination, when they had been advocating for themselves, that in fact those behaviors, those characteristics that they had struggled to regain in their lives have become pathologized and used against them. So he also asked me, why was I being so argumentative, and was I worried about what others would think, which sort of took me by surprise as someone who's worked quite hard in their lives to address stigma and discrimination. As he was a resident, I was able to ask to see the consulting physician in the practice, but the resident didn't allow me to see him. Thankfully, he did go and speak to him about my situation. And very quickly, within 5 minutes, he had come back stating that the consulting physician had confirmed that everything I was experiencing could in fact be side effects of the medication and had recommended I stop taking the drug immediately, and he sent me on my way. So after this experience, I made sure that it was on my chart in the family practice that I never see this particular doctor again. I have his name written down, so if that's an appointment I get, I refuse it. I ask to see someone else. I've also since then developed a clear plan with my family about what I would want to happen if I was ever in this position again, and even more particularly if I have to go to hospital. And then finally, it's important to know the impact that this had on me is that I spent over a year in counseling specifically dealing with the trauma of the side effects of the medication and, quite frankly, the trauma of that single interaction with the physician. So this is really, I wanted to share with you as an example of the impact of what can happen when the relationship goes wrong and personal recovery is not respected. But despite this one experience, I know, though, that I have a great experience. I've experienced great privilege in being able to determine, for the most part, the supportive relationships in my life, where many of my peers have not. And it's not uncommon for individuals to experience family and friends distancing themselves due to a feeling of being overwhelmed, or not knowing what to do, or sometimes just having had enough, or individuals isolating from their families and friends for a range of reasons, including not feeling understood, not wanting to be perceived as a burden, internalized stigma, and then, of course, the histories that some people have of familiar trauma or abuse. Adding to that experience may be providers or carers that believe they're doing what's best for people or know what's best despite a person having shared their dreams, their goals, and preferred choices. Oops, sorry, I'm skipping slides. It's not working for me there. So Pat Deegan has said about the recovery process that the task is not to become normal. The task is to take up your journey of recovery and to become who you are called to be. So it's the unique task of each individual to decide or work to determine who it is they are called to be. And without human interactions, however, I don't believe this is possible because healing and recovery do not occur in a vacuum. We know that individuals become isolated and disconnected from their communities, have a much harder time in their recovery process than those who do experience meaningful connectedness and citizenship. For some, healing and recovery means having formal connections with the mental health system. And when this is the case, if those connections reflect the values of personal recovery, which I would describe as being healthy, mutually respectful, and dignified relationships, recovery outcomes, as determined by the individual, are more easily achieved and far more likely to last or be sustained over time. So, for instance, the evidence shows us that when an individual chooses to have family or friends involved in their care, this support can result in shorter periods of prolonged illness, shorter hospitalizations, improved relationships with others, and often a greater likelihood of achieving one's own personal recovery goals, not the outcomes that Brian referred to earlier, those clinical outcomes, but their own personal recovery goals, whatever they might be. So we also know from the evidence, and certainly from my own experience working in an inpatient setting would bear this out, that when a relationship between an individual using services and a provider of services, whether it be a physician, a nurse, or a peer support provider, is defined by mutual respect and trust, driven by patient goals or individual person-driven goals, and that support self-determination as much as possible, all persons in the relationship are more likely to feel engaged. They're more likely to feel satisfied and successful in achieving common goals and the individual goals of their respective role. So being who you are called to be also takes time. It takes thoughtfulness. It requires exposure to a variety of opportunities and having a sense of safety when one's doing that, feeling personally empowered, and in some instances, having a crowd of cheerleaders on the sidelines to encourage us and celebrate our successes. It also means that when we share with others our hopes and dreams, that we don't get told we can't do something or we aren't good enough or we're too ill or too fragile, but we experience validation, encouragement, and support to test and try new things. So I realize I kind of run the risk of appearing rather Pollyanna-ish about this or having that idealism that was referred to earlier, and I recognize that despite recovery being on the agenda for decades, despite individuals sharing their stories about what made recovery possible for them and exemplifying through kind of being the living and breathing evidence of recovery, that what I'm describing is indeed an ideal and not yet a reality for many. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about what's getting in the way. So Brian's already spoken eloquently about some of the challenges, the barriers, and quite frankly, the contrariness to recovery orientation that exists within our own system, our services, and indeed within some of the therapeutic relationships. But I want to delve a bit deeper into some of those things that continue to get in the way of recovery being personal at an individual relationship level. So one of the roles I'm fortunate to have is I facilitate professional competency sessions with first-year medical students. So it's their first year in medicine. They're not yet practicing physicians or clerks. It's really right at the beginning of their careers. And one of the many topics of conversation is often around power and privilege. So in my experience, power and privilege reign supreme in the relational context between those living with mental illness and those who don't. The power to diagnose and label, the power to take away autonomy and self-determination, the power to determine capacity and status are so well entrenched and defined, prescribed, and legislated within our mental health care system. The less prescribed, but quite frankly, equally entrenched elements of power and privilege within these relationships are often defined by those who have and those who have not. So things like education, money, employment, opportunity, loving relationships, etc. And while not prescribed, they are a reality that can get in the way. They get in the way of being empathetic. They can get in the way of being hopeful, of someone feeling empowered, or of someone else letting go of power when necessary. The clear overlap between power and privilege and the social determinants of health is evident here, I hope. The constructs of power and privilege are further compounded by imbalances due to gender, culture, ethnicity, sexual orientation, geographic location, etc. And as with many things that we're talking about today, this in and of itself could be a 90-minute webinar. So stigma and discrimination are often a result of power or seeking power based on one's beliefs and attitudes. So when someone experiences stigma and discrimination, they automatically, in my opinion, experience a lack of power or control over something. Something is denied them or taken away from them, including often one's dignity, self-esteem, and self-efficacy. So this, in turn, can result in an inability to access a range of services, supports, and networks, including healthcare services. In my job and in my role and just in my life, when I hear people's experience of stigma, it has most often occurred in healthcare settings and even more frequently in mental health care settings. And the result of this is that individuals often don't want to return to those settings or engage in a relationship with people who might perpetuate that discrimination. So stigma and discrimination limit access to helpful relationships. And for many, though access to helpful relationships is limited because of where they live, what they know about the system, what label or diagnosis they might have, and by what others believe should be available to them or not. And finally, what often gets in the way of supporting someone's personal recovery is an aversion or lack of tolerance others have for risk-taking. And ironically, the type of risk that people often struggle with are those most of us take for granted every day. So the idea of living independently or applying for jobs, even jobs we might not be qualified for, moving away from family and friends, living on one's own, or having intimate relationships, having children. Certain systems are set up purposely to be risk-aversive, and I work in a hospital, and a hospital system is one of those systems. But it's less about the risk an individual is taking, and it's more about the risk that means a service or organization is taking in supporting someone. Relationships that can support risk, that is, support people in seeking out their opportunities to reach their goals and achieve their hopes and dreams, are ones that truly honor personal recovery. Those that are not able to do this or struggle with this end up impeding the recovery process by denying a person their intrinsic right to risk and learn from their mistakes or to adjust their path as need be so it makes sense in becoming the person they choose to be. So with all of this in mind, what you've heard from Brian and now what I've shared with you, what do the core principles of recovery as personal look like in practice through a relational lens? I'm sure if we could interact more directly, many of you would share examples from your own experience that exemplify these principles in action, but we can't do that, so I'm going to share some with you. So really good examples would be listening to individuals, validating them, considering the whole person and not just the diagnosis or labels we attach to a diagnosis, exploring who they were before the illness and who they want to be beyond the illness and who they are now beyond that illness. Where does someone come from and where do they want to be in the future? Just a few examples of how we can exemplify the principles in action. Providers are often in positions that give them the authority to allow or deny personal power, and it's important in relationships that power is relinquished to support people in making informed choices about the things that matter to them. Recovery can be undermined when we fail to recognize the inherent strengths someone has and rather focus on what they can't do or have struggled to achieve in the past. Living with illness in and of itself shows enormous strength and resilience, and we need to build on that. Being willing to work together and learn and grow together is part of the relationship process. To disengage when we don't agree with the choices a person makes is a form of wielding power and potentially coercive. To remain supportive and engaged in ongoing mutual reflection of what's working and how things can be improved is, in my opinion, an authentic relationship, regardless of your role. And although, we've talked about what complicates it, the principles in and of themselves are not complicated. What makes them complicated are all the issues and constructs that we've been referring to over the last hour. In and of themselves, the principles are really straightforward. So for the last few minutes, and we want to save time for questions so everyone has an opportunity to do that, I want to share a story with you. So this is Matthew's story, and I'm just going to do one scenario here. Matthew is a 27-year-old man who has been recently diagnosed with schizophrenia. It's taken several years for Matthew to receive this diagnosis despite having been in and out of the mental health system since his early 20s. Matthew is currently on an inpatient unit in a specialized mental health hospital and is hoping to be discharged in the next few weeks. Matthew has been an involuntary patient for most of his hospital stay and was deemed incapable of making treatment decisions for himself. Matthew's mother is his substitute decision maker for treatment only. Prior to this hospitalization, Matthew had been living very successfully on his terms for several years with a roommate and worked part-time at HMV. He had been thinking about going back to school to do a master's degree, but because he hadn't been feeling very well, had been putting it off. Due to his lengthy hospitalization, Matthew has lost his job and his roommate has found someone else to share the rent. Matthew hasn't lived at home with his family since his late teens, just prior to going to university to complete an undergrad degree in modern languages. Matthew's inpatient care team are working closely with a community-based case management program to transition him from hospital to community. Matthew doesn't agree with his diagnosis and is reluctant to engage in the treatment goals defined by either team. He says he does feel better since he's been in hospital and is looking forward to finding a new apartment and going back to HMV as soon as possible. Matthew has also asked for help to explore what his options would be if he wanted to go back to school part-time in the future. Both teams believe Matthew should live in a residential care home similar to a lodging home in some areas and not work until he shows increased awareness of his illness and agrees to engage fully in the treatment required to keep him out of hospital. They, along with his family, have suggested he not think about going back to school right now, but will look into what groups he might be able to participate in to fill his time. So Matthew's story is not an individually true story. It does, however, I think, reflect the experience of many people, both in hospital and in the community. And although the scenario I've shared with you is fairly hospital-centric or inpatient-centric, many of the issues that I think are highlighted in it would occur in a community setting as well. So this is where we're going to try the interactive piece, and I'm relying on Carla and Benita to help me out here. So we're hoping that having heard Matthew's story, that you can take a minute to respond to the statement that's been put on the screen, and I'll read it to you quickly, and just pick either true or false in your opinion. So the statement is, individuals with limited awareness or appreciation into their illness, often labeled lack of insight, can experience all of the core values of personal recovery. And then the core values are listed. So is that true or false in your opinion?
Fiona, we're just going to give people another moment or so. It looks like there's still a few people just logging in their answers. So as Fiona mentioned, it's on the right-hand side of your screen. You can just click on either the true or false and then hit the submit button, and we'll receive your response, and then we'll just preview the results in a moment.
Great. Thanks, Carla. So interesting, as I look at the results, so it looks like about just over 50% of the group agree it's the true statement. Far less, 15 out of the whole group are struggling and think that it's false. And then 80% are maybe those are the ones that are struggling and kind of not sure whether it's true or false. And so I'll be really honest that this answer doesn't surprise me in the least, because often you know, I think many of us believe absolutely it doesn't matter what else is going on in someone's life, that recovery and the core principles around recovery being personal, autonomy, self-determination need to be upheld at all times. But people do struggle. It is controversial in different settings. Teams struggle with whether or not they can support people making choices and taking risks. And I think this is really about taking risks and how, in Matthew's case, the team feels comfortable. What is their risk tolerance around Matthew's ability to take risks? So if it is something you're struggling with or not sure about, then I invite you really to reflect more on where in your practice or in your life, what are the discrete core principles that are at play there, and maybe what can you do, or who can you talk to, or where can you inform your practice in a way that you feel you're better able to support those core principles. So we have another interactive piece. Again, the statement will be repeated, and we'd like you to choose one of the options available to you on the screen. So again, the statement is, individuals with limited awareness, appreciation to their illness, often labeled lack of insight, can experience all of the core values of personal recovery. So choose one of the responses from below, that you feel you can actively support this in your role, that you find it challenging to support that in your role, that you can't support it because the system, program, or department has barriers to you being able to do that, or that you can't support it due to your beliefs about recovery. So we'll give you a few minutes again to choose your response.
Okay, Fiona, we're just going to give people another moment here. So if you haven't made your selection, again, just hit the radio button on the right-hand side of your screen and then hit the submit button, and we'll show the poll results in just a moment. Great, so I'm just looking at the responses of those who answered, and there seems to be a bit of a division between those who feel they can actively support it in their role. A higher percentage of those that responded say that. And then the rest of the group, almost the rest of the group, feel that it's a challenge to support in the role. And then others are saying that there are system and program barriers to supporting that. So it, again, doesn't surprise me in the least, although I must say I am thrilled to see the high number of people who feel that they can actively support it in their role on a regular basis. But I would have actually guessed that the majority of the group would say they find it challenging, and not necessarily because of their own beliefs, as we see there's zero answered there, but often because of the culture of the areas that they work in, the culture of the system that Brian spoke so eloquently about, and the barriers that exist there, that it can be challenging, that I as an individual may support personal recovery, but if the person beside me doesn't support it, how do I get there? I as an individual may support it, but the peer I'm working with may not feel empowered enough themselves and may not have that self-confidence yet to actually support it and recognize that they can achieve personal recovery. So often there's a lot of work to do in that regard. I think with the lesson here for me and the message, the takeaway message that I'd like to leave everyone with is to really explore now in your own role and in your own lives, whether they be professional or personal, where are the opportunities to continue to actively support the core principles and to reflect on your practice or to reflect on your relationships and what those look like, regardless of which part of that relationship you're fulfilling. Who can you get on your side? What resources do you need, and what resources are available to you? So
There are numerous tools to use to even self-assess your own recovery orientation, but also to assess the recovery orientation of organizations, and very importantly, and almost most importantly, to gain the perspective of people with lived experience on how they perceive the recovery orientation of the services, and therefore the relationships, the people that they're interacting with, and how that's impacting on their own recovery. But a great place to start, I think, is to use the reflective practice tools that are within the guidelines, and to start asking yourself some of the same questions with each section of those reflective practice questions. You know, can you actively support each area? If not, what are the challenges? Can you do something about them? To think about your own autonomy and own locus of control over those things, and what you can change and who you need to get involved if you can't. So I'm going to end there because I recognize we're almost done and we really wanted to leave some time for questions, but I thank you very much for your attention and look forward to hearing future webinars.
That's great. Thank you very much, Fiona, for your part of the presentation. And we certainly have a lot of questions that have come in, but I'll just remind people, if you do want to ask a question of either Brian and Fiona and you haven't submitted it to us already, if you could just type that into either the Q&A or the chat using all panelists as the drop-down. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can with the 15 minutes or so that we have remaining. So, Brian, maybe I'll kick off with a question for you, and we'll make sure that you're unmuted so that you can answer some of these as well. We did have quite a few questions that came in the context of your presentation around peer support. And one of them was a follow-up question when you were talking about some of the boundaries that professionals might be concerned about. And this was in the context of peer support. And again, peer supporters being mindful of those boundaries like dependency. So what, in your view, are some of the best approaches that can offset that concern about dependency?
Just being honest, being direct about the particular nature of the relationship, that it is about support, but you know, it's not necessarily about friendship. It's you know, friendship is built into the relationship in terms of the care that gets expressed. But you know, it's natural and adult-like to see, experience, and create boundaries, but to do so in a way that's healthy, that's upfront, that's direct, so such that people do not have unrealistic expectations of the nature of the relationship. So yes, people have to be careful that somebody is not led to believe that this is a special friendship. The same emotions may get expressed, but it's not a true friendship. It is a helping relationship, and one needs to be clear and comfortably upfront about that, but not in a way that puts limits on the quality of emotion that may get expressed.
That's great. Thanks very much, Brian. Fiona, one of the questions that came in from your presentation is around how we can sort of empower people that may have a mental illness so that they're in a better position maybe to advocate for themselves, in particular for those maybe who aren't as familiar with some of their treatment options might look like. I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Sure. So the first thing I'll say is I think it's actually a bit of a fallacy to think that we empower other individuals. What I think empowerment is actually about is when others relinquish some of their power so that I can draw on my own personal sense of power and therefore be empowered. So that's the first thing I'll say. It's setting up a dynamic in which people are letting go of some power so other people can regain the power that they already have or should have. In terms of specifically around advocating and being informed around treatment decisions, I think a lot of the work that can be done can certainly be done through peer support, and Brian's spoken about that. But I think also practitioners have both a moral and ethical responsibility, and often it's regulated by their healthcare profession, to be giving adequate information so people can make choices. The reality is that that doesn't always happen. So ensuring that there are opportunities outside of the clinical relationship for people to access information and to distill that information and to be able to understand it in a way that they can make decisions related to their self may be important. And so certainly we do that through offering peer support that can support people doing that, through having resource centers or educational materials, having allies within the community that can support people doing that. I think the other really important thing is that when people advocate for themselves is that it's not seen as a behavioral challenge and or pathologized as part of an illness, is that we know, and you know, like survivors speak very eloquently about the importance of being able to advocate for oneself is a huge piece of the recovery process. And if we don't support that, then we're impeding recovery.
That's great. Thanks, Fiona. Brian, another question for you from someone who's working in the supportive housing field. Their question is, what are some specific ways that workers and organizations can create and open up space for peer support, peer education, and peer advocacy from a community setting?
A myriad of ways. There's, you know, it depends on your imagination or your level of what level of information you can share. I mean, take your topic and run it through YouTube and see if you can find something to share with the community in order to get a conversation started. Or invite somebody in who's doing peer work and invite somebody in to do a little focus group with some of the people that may be interested. Or just creating a network within the housing context where certain people volunteer to act in a peer support capacity. And so it really does come down to the culture of the agency, whether it's supportive of the recovery principles, and to the extent that the residents are aware of it and keen to learn more about it. So it really does come down to conversation, stimulation, and engagement in terms of whether peer support takes off. But you've got to have the opportunity for people to meet and talk and feel the immediate benefits of peer support just by getting the ball rolling.
Great, thanks, Brian. Fiona, we have a few questions that relate to substitute decision-making, which is something that you covered in your presentation. One specific question about how that might be handled in a situation where an individual is maybe experiencing an episode for the first time. So maybe they haven't yet had an opportunity, as you described, to have that dialogue with family members or others on how they might want to direct their care, whether you have any suggestions on how individuals' autonomy could be preserved in those situations.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's particularly challenging in the situation that you just described during a first episode, and where emotions are running high for everybody, and what people really want to do is solve the problem and remove sort of the pain and trauma of the experience that's happening. So, again, I think both Brian and I are maybe harping on the same chord here, is that peer support can be incredibly valuable in moments like that, so that the individual is given opportunities, even during an acute stage of their illness, to have a voice and to even if their decision-making power has been removed, is to be able to talk about what they feel would be important to them, what they don't want to feel, what side effects they don't want to have, or what they couldn't imagine tolerating. What is it beyond the treatment of symptoms, but in their life that they want to be able to achieve, and how might decisions around treatment impact on those goals. And often having someone like a peer support worker or a neutral party to be able to talk that through with someone to help them have a voice. You know, really, morally, we have an obligation to, even when substitute decision makers are assigned to individuals, is to uphold the choices that someone has expressed as much as we possibly can. You know, the opportunity exists there then for the relationship that people have together to grow and to be a positive one rather than a really negative one, which is often what happens when people are struggling and at odds with those particular decisions at really heightened emotional moments in their lives.
Okay, thanks, Fiona. Brian, we've got a question for you as well about how we might be able to merge forces with the consumer survivor movement and the more formal biomedical model and sort of take the best of both worlds and move the agenda forward. Wondering if you could comment on that.
Probably the best way to move it forward is to provide more recognition in the form of funding and structural autonomy for survivor services. There's ample evidence for what they can provide to the community, and it's widely recognized, as mentioned in my slides, that peer support is a best practice. And so if we keep it on the sidelines, of course, it's never going to be able to meet with psychiatry in terms of any kind of equality. And so obviously the first thing that needs to be done is that funding happen, and it troubles me that there is such a rift, such a chasm between community mental health and psychiatry. I do feel like they are aloof to the work that's being done, to the philosophy that's being articulated, to the good things that are coming out of it. I'm not saying they're aloof. They're in a separate silo. I shouldn't say they're aloof, I did, but I shouldn't say that. It's more that they're in a kind of a structural isolation, and in fact, you know, they may be satisfied, but I feel like they are losing out. And so relative to Ron Coleman's point, I feel that it's in their interest to learn more of what is stimulating and elevating community mental health beyond its previous conservatism and paternalism. So I think great things are unfolding in recovery as a result of the incendiary and precipitating role of the survivor movement. So you know, things are unfolding, but you know, unless things happen on the ground, unless innovation is demonstrated, unless we see some real good work happening in terms of what survivor leadership can provide for with adequate recognition and appropriate funding levels, you know, we're not going to be able to move the recovery model past the level of a correctness thing. You know, it's really more important that at all levels recovery is so it's not just a matter of bringing psychiatry and survivors closer together in dialogue. It's how do you get the whole movement in dialogue more in line with what the survivor movement precipitated in terms of the evolution of recovery. So it's on some levels we're stuck in, you know, okay, we had a rush, we got off on that topic. It's exciting, but now it's business as usual. So again, I put it back to the Mental Health Commission of Canada to be a little more blunt in respect of the need to reconcile sometimes what seem like irreconcilable differences between the community and the institutional sectors. But you know, the institutional sector isn't moved to come to the table because, you know, they hold all the cards. They get most of the funding. We said a long time ago in mental health reform that we should move more funding, a greater percentage of funding, health dollars to the community sector, away from the institutional sector. But I don't believe that has occurred. whereas in Britain it's like 80% community and 20% institutional. It might be the reverse here, or the converse here. So that's what's really going on. Yes, it'd be great to have psychiatry and survivors in dialogue, because I believe psychiatry has the most to learn. So yes, I would encourage that to happen, but I don't see it happening, and neither do I see the local health integrated networks really getting on board with recovery in a way that would encourage greater dialogue and partnership either. So it's a good question, but really it points to bigger questions and wider chasms separating the people with the good ideas from the people that have the dollars.
And it sounds like that might even be a topic that we could have a whole another 90-minute webinar on. So unfortunately, yeah, and I know we have a lot more questions that have come in, unfortunately, than we'll have time to answer today, but I did want to just take a few moments to remind people that our next webinar is taking place on Friday, May the 27th, so it is on a Friday rather than our usual Thursday schedule. The topic for that will be on recovery occurring in the context of one's life, and we'll be joined by our two presenters, Regina Casey and Catherine Stewart. So we certainly hope that you'll be able to join us for that. We'd also like to remind you that today's webinar has been recorded and should be on our website in the archive section in about 2 weeks' time, and we'll also be posting the presentation deck from both Brian and Fiona so that you can access the slides from the website as well. And I'll remind you as well that when you close the webinar, you'll receive a pop-up to ask you to fill out the evaluation. So again, we just remind you, if you'd like to continue receiving notices to future events and webinars from us, you do need to opt in to those communications, and that we'll ask you that question on the survey. So thank you to everyone who joined in for the webinar today, and a special thank you to both of our presenters, Brian McKinnon and Fiona Wilson, and also to our team here at the Mental Health Commission, Benita Varga, Hannah Kohler, and Amy LeBlanc, who were assisting us behind the scenes. So big thank you to all of you, in particular Brian and Fiona, and everyone for joining us, and we hope that you'll join us next month as we continue on with the series on recovery. So thanks again, and have a great rest of the day, everyone.
Oh, thank you. Congratulations. Oh, thanks so much. Yeah. Yeah? Yeah. I feel like it was an important perspective. It wasn't too general, too obvious? No, I think, I mean,